be a part of this lectureship. Appreciate very much the efforts of those that have planned it, those that have been engaged in presenting the lessons. This is a valuable study, and it's a very timely, very needed study. The subject of the lectureship, or the theme of the lectureship, Premillennialism, true or false, I think was not intended to express any kind of doubt as to whether it is true or false. But we do want to present the things in an objective way and give full consideration to the fact that there may be some things that we may not understand about it and may be wrong about. History, however, has, it seems to me, already rendered a verdict as to whether premillennialism is true or false. Premillennialism is an old subject. The roots of premillennialism go back all the way to the Jewish apocalyptic literature of the 2nd century BC. And so it's been around for all of these centuries, and certainly it's with us today very much. But out of all of the views that have been expressed regarding premillennialism, regarding the coming of Christ before and in order to initiate a 1,000-year literal reign upon the earth, a period of bliss, a period of happiness, renovation of the earth, and a literal rule of Christ upon the earth, all of the things that have been written by people in previous generations, in previous centuries, are many indeed, and all of them have not come to pass, we know. And so history has given us a verdict, and that verdict is that all of these speculations are, of course, erroneous. We should like today to talk briefly about Chiliasm or premillennialism in the early church. And this certainly is the ground out of which the modern concept has its growth and inspiration. And then we want to focus on the Restoration movement and some of the developments within the Restoration movement, particularly some of the things that caused division in the church, some of the movements that emerged from the history of the movement, and the conclusion regarding these developments, and some admonition regarding the present situation. In the first part, we should like to recommend the study of the church in the early patristic period, the period prior to the time of Augustine, so that we might be familiar with the development of the idea of the millennium in this time, be able to understand exactly what took place, and to be able to point out to people who use or who misuse the things that were said by some of these people in the early church, to be able to refute and to point out that these things are not an accurate representation of the viewpoint of the early church. The book Premillennialism in America by William Rutgers is based upon, or is actually, a doctoral dissertation. This book was published in 1930, and it is an in-depth study of premillennialism in America. And it is really, I suppose, the finest and deepest study of the history that has been presented thus far. Now, I recommend this very highly. It's probably not available, but you could find in print, but you can find it, I'm sure, in some of the good libraries, if you have access to them. Rutgers says that it is undoubted that the roots of modern premillennialism and the inspiration for it is drawn from the Jewish apocalyptic and pseudo-apocalyptic literature of the 3 centuries beginning in 200 AD and ending about 200 BC and ending about 100 AD. He says, quote, "The principles underlying this literature and a principle which reappears in modern premillennialism are pessimism, determinism, externalism, one-sided literalism, dualism, fantastic realism in the concept or the conception of the future. And he says that these people make of God just a sort of a mechanical God, and they have a mechanical view of history. He says that Chiliasm and premillennialism has its roots in this particular Jewish apocalyptic cannot be gainsaid. The people who came out of this kind of background, the Jewish background, into the early church, of course, were familiar with this non-canonical Jewish literature. And it is from this source and from these people that the influence that we see in the early church is to be found. The early patristic writers are immediately indebted to this literature, not to the writings of the New Testament, for their eschatology, because it's borrowed from this pre-Christian and non-Christian source. The transition by the Jews to the Christian eschatology, or the eschatology that was found in the early church after the death of the apostles, was a rather easy transition, you can imagine. But he says that the historical argument that the premillennialists, dispensationalists present, namely that the eschatological element was the all-controlling idea or the prevalent doctrine in the church regarding the kingdom in the first and second century, that this is simply not true. These people confidently assert this historical argument, and they grab bits of statements and bits of writings wherever they possibly can find them, and try to formulate from these a view that supports their ideas regarding the kingdom today. But notice what Rutgers says in his in-depth study of this period in the history of the church, comparing it with the modernistic ideas of the millennium. He says, amazingly meager indeed are the direct and explicit statements which can, by any show of reasonableness, be claimed as evidence for Chiliasm. To imagine that we can distill from these rare fragments the orthodox faith of the early church is a huge assumption. Even more preposterous is its claim that these barren, feeble utterances represent Chiliasm in its modern premillennial manifestation. Premillennialism or Chiliasm found no favor with the best of the apostolic fathers. Support from the apologists, too, he says, is extremely meager. Only one from among their number can be, with any reasonable fairness, can be claimed. And that is found in the writings of Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. In the early church, there was a parallel development to the development of the Chiliastic viewpoint. This was a development that sought to refute this idea. And this, of course, emerges as the view of Origen and Philo and others who championed the viewpoint that we know of as the idea that all of this is allegory, the allegorical interpretation, known so well as in association with Philo and Origen, based upon the Platonic idealistic philosophy. This shows that the prevalent idea in the early church was not that is claimed by premillennialism regarding the millennium. The canonization of the book of Revelation was involved in this, and it was because of the things that were said in the book of Revelation, and because of the speculative ideas and the things that were expressed by some of the people in those times, that the book of Revelation was, of course, questionable as to its canonicity. And so this really did not last very long because of opposition and because it really was not very widespread. And of course, by the time Augustine had come on the scene, it really did not, exist or did not prevail beyond the time of Augustine because of his amillennial theology. And it was so effective that it destroyed the ideas and quenched the millennial ideas of these people. Following Augustine, of course, there were a number of centuries during which the ideas of Augustine prevailed. Other people seem to have an amillennial view of the kingdom, or rather of the millennium. Other studies have been conducted that would concur with the conclusions of Rutgers. I will not take the time to notice them, because we want to get into the Restoration movement. But men like Adolf Harnack have looked at the period prior to the time of Augustine, and says that there really is no way that the modern millennialists can cite these utterances or these positions as representative of theirs, because in their use of them they really destroy the concepts that these people had. Because the people in the early church were people who did not separate the kingdom and the church and the reign of Christ and the millennium from the church, as is done by modern millennials. In the Reformation, there arose, and modern postmillennialism is indebted to a man by the name of Daniel Whitby, who lived in the 17th and early 18th centuries. His treatise on the millennium influenced people toward the position of postmillennialism, and evidently influenced some of the people in the early Restoration movement. He evidently was the principal cause of Walter Scott espousing the postmillennial viewpoint in the late 1820s and early 1830s. But dispensationalism as a new type of premillennialism emerges in the early part of the 19th century. And as you've already heard from others who have spoken, John Nelson Darby, who was born in 1800 and died in 1882, was probably the most influential man in this area. His form of premillennialism has evolved into the modern dispensationalism that is so prevalent today. Darby's contribution has been, of course, quite extensive. He came to America in 1862 and was quite influential in America. His writings were quite extensively circulated, and along with his writings, the writings of others, and the Schofield Bible finally in 1909, and a book by W.E. Blackstone, Jesus is Coming. These things have contributed to the adoption of the premillennial and dispensational viewpoint that is so prevalent today. The Schofield Bible, for instance, as has already been mentioned before, is a book that has notes and references that set forth the premillennial and dispensational viewpoint. It represents itself as something that will enable the student to take it and, by a system of connected topical references, be able to find all of the great truths of the divine revelation. He says in the introduction that these are so traced through the entire Bible, from the first mention to the last, that the reader may for himself follow the gradual unfolding of these. Now, Philip Morrow, who was a dispensationalist until he studied himself out of it, in his book, The Gospel of the Kingdom, observes that the Schofield Reference Bible does not do what it claims to do with regard to the kingdom of God and the teaching of the Bible regarding the kingdom. He says that in the New Testament there are 139 verses that contain some statement regarding the kingdom of God. And out of the 139, the Schofield Bible makes references to only 21, leaving 118 verses totally unnoticed. And out of the 17 New Testament books that mention the kingdom, only 5 are cited or used in any way in these references to depict the concept that it presents regarding the kingdom of God. This, of course, is a very valuable expose of the Schofield Reference Bible, which is so prevalent today. Now, in the early Restoration movement, there were, of course, many men who espoused some form of millennialism. In fact, most of the men probably had some idea concerning the millennium, and the predominant idea in the early Restoration movement was that of postmillennialism. Barton W. Stone was a premillennialist, and there were a few others who were. But Stone was a little earlier than Campbell and Scott. Stone preached, and his most effective work was done in a period when the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening in America, was, of course, sweeping the frontier. And many people thought that this was surely one of the signs of the imminent coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of a reign of Christ upon the earth. The developments in European history also underscored this in the minds of these people. The wars of Europe, what happened to the papacy and the Ottoman Empire, and the expectancy that the Jews would return to Palestine caused many people to think that the return of the Lord was immediate. And Stone was evidently influenced greatly by these ideas. But the men who came a couple of decades later were men who espoused a post-millennial idea. They did not think that the Lord would come prior to the millennium, but following the millennium. And they felt that the millennium was necessary before the Lord would come. Now, the program of restoration that Alexander Campbell began was a program that had as its very core what he called the millennial church, what he and Walter Scott called the millennial church. They felt that the millennium, the coming of the millennium, was imminent. They did not believe that Christ would come and inaugurate the millennium, but he would come at the end of the millennium. And we have a quote to show that this is Campbell's viewpoint without any question. But Campbell's program was a program of unity, a program wherein he pled for the unity of all people upon the Bible and the Bible alone. He pled for one creed, a belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and the acceptance of Jesus Christ as the one who had all authority, and his word as the one book that should guide and lead and unite us. He felt like that in order for the work of the church to succeed, it was necessary for there to be one church and just one book of authority. While men could disagree in the areas of opinion, there were certain essential doctrines that were necessary. And he felt that by evangelism, by world evangelism, the millennium could be brought in. The millennium would start as a result of the evangelistic work of the people of his day. Walter Scott thought of beginning a periodical called the Millennial Herald. He wanted to herald the approach of the millennium. And he felt that the church, in order for the millennium to come, had to be greatly evangelistic. Because Campbell had already decided to change the name of his paper from the Christian Baptist to the Millennial Harbinger, Stone did not begin his paper, but deferred to Campbell. But Stone did, shortly after, begin a paper called The Evangelist. His emphasis on evangelism was for the purpose of bringing about the knowledge of the gospel, the knowledge of the Word of God throughout the world, that there might be a reign of Christ upon all of the earth. Campbell felt that in order for men to be one, in order for the churches to unite together, there had to be a presentation of the ancient order of things, or the religion of the New Testament had to be restored. And he says, just so far as that has occurred, the millennium has commenced. He repeated this conviction. This was stated in the first volume of the Millennial Harbinger. He repeated this earlier. He had said this earlier in the debate with Robert Owen. And he wrote a number of articles on this and printed a number of articles upon it during the time when he was editor of the Christian, or rather of the Millennial Harbinger, well, also in the Christian Baptist. And so he says that the object of the Millennial Harbinger, in the first volume, he says its object was the development and the introduction of that political and religious order of society called the millennium. As we've said, Campbell and Scott spoke often of the millennial church, and Scott spoke of the age as the age of evangelism. In the second issue of the Harbinger, Campbell says, there is now a scheme of things presented in what is called the ancient gospel for the whole superstructure called the millennial church. It will alone be the instrument of converting the whole human race and of uniting all Christians on one and the same foundation. But Campbell really thought that journalism was more of a vital force than preaching. This is the reason why his journal was begun. This is the reason why he began the Christian Baptist initially. He, of course, sent his papers out free of charge because he was postmaster and he had the privilege of franking, and it didn't cost him anything to mail out his material, and so he printed them and mailed them out at will. And this was very much a part of his program. Another part of his program was his debating. In his debates, he pled for a restoration and for a New Testament concept of the church and of Christianity. He also believed that the educational process was very important. He recommended that in the public schools, the Bible and nothing but the Bible be taught to the students. And of course, his establishment of Bethany College was in line with the purpose that he had expressed with regard to the hope and the expectations of bringing in the millennium. A recent study by a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma has looked into the idea of Campbell being a utopian, a Christian utopian. Campbell was similar in his viewpoint to many of the people of his day, setting up of utopias in certain places in the United States was, of course, very much a part of this period. But Campbell's Christian utopian viewpoint was a world-wide view. He thought that the church, in its evangelism, in its presentation of primitive Christianity, would effect throughout the whole world a knowledge of the Lord, and this would create the reign of Christ in the hearts of all the people of the world, and this would be truly a universal Christian utopia. This really is the program that Campbell sought to bring about. And of course, his work was to this end. He felt that we needed a Catholic approach, that is, a universal approach. He even recommended that there be a conference called, representatives from all of the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church also, if they wanted to come, be called, and that they agreed to unite upon those things that were commonly held by all of them that were taught in the Bible and discard everything else. And let our position that would unite us be simply that is Catholic and universal, holding to those things as the essential things. Campbell also believed that it was necessary that we have the Bible in the language of the people, and he worked diligently to bring about a better understanding of the Word of God through the presentation and the work that he did upon putting the Bible into the language of the man of that day. He spoke concerning this in 1852 when he spoke before the convention of the American Bible Union, for which he did the translation of the book of Acts. He says, in order then to pray and to preach and to labor for a millennium, we must have a Bible that is most explicit on this great subject, that is baptism. There cannot be a millennium, a united church, without acknowledging one Lord, one faith, one baptism. If then the Christian church ever becomes really and visibly one, she must have one immersion or one baptism. And if she become not one, what is the hope of a millennium? It is a dream. Now, recently viewpoints have been presented that claim that Alexander Campbell abandoned his concept of primitive Christianity being essential to the unity and the oneness of the church and the establishment of the millennium, that he gave up this idea of oneness and he espoused the cause of pluralism, a sort of something of a union of Protestant bodies, not the basic concept of the one church as he had formerly presented. But I find no evidence of this. I can find quotations from Campbell later than the date when he was supposed to have changed and accepted something of a political idea involving America as a redeemer nation. He felt that, of course, the nation of America or the United States and even all of the English-speaking nations are nations that would make it possible for world evangelism to be possible. And he felt that this was very fortunate. It was very fortunate for the church that the United States was the place where the church had succeeded so much. But he never gave up his concept of the one church. He never espoused pluralism. Campbell wrote a number of numbers of articles on the millennium, and he printed articles by others, by Brother McCorkle, by Brother Barclay, the missionary to Jerusalem, by Robert Milligan. But most of these were predominantly post-millennial in viewpoint. The claim that is made by some premillennialists today, some of our premillennial brethren, that these men were premillennialists. And they're very careful to quote from these men statements that seem to support the concept of premillennialism. But to make the claim that men like Campbell and Scott and Barclay and Robert Milligan and others believe that Christ must come and will come before the millennium is unfounded. For example, Campbell in his 1941 series gives 7 facts which, quote, inconvertibly show that the Lord cannot possibly come in person before the millennium. And yet people quote Campbell as a premillennialist. People urged Campbell to write more on the millennium, but he said, well, he didn't want to be like some of the brethren that he knew. They were somewhat like the moon. He said that they gave little light, no heat, and went through many changes. I think we can find some of the bases of Campbell's thinking upon cooperation and the missionary society in his program of the millennium being brought in by the evangelism. He felt that in order for the millennium to occur, the church had to succeed in uniting upon the Bible. And he felt that in order for the millennium to occur, the gospel had to be preached in its purity throughout the whole world. And his thinking upon cooperation in the missionary society is affected by this concept, or by this purpose, or by this program. And this is why he felt that the church needed the kind of organization that was found in the missionary society. In fact, he didn't think it was big enough. You remember, Brother Deaver, when we were studying this in one of the classes that we had, Campbell was really disappointed that so few brethren came to the first meeting of the missionary society. He wasn't there, but less than 200 people came. That's not really representative. Campbell was really disappointed in this. And so this was very much a part of his thinking and program with regard to the bringing in of the millennium. Well, of course, this didn't occur. The millennium did not come. So you might ask the question, is postmillennialism true or false? Well, the postmillennialism of that period was false. The premillennialism of that period was false. History has said that it's false. That's what history says plainly. And that's right before your eyes. You know, people want to see prophecy being fulfilled right before their eyes. Well, right before their eyes, if you have any kind of sense of history, you can know that the concept is not a right concept, because it just simply did not happen as they thought it would. These people were sincere and they were honest, but, you know, history has falsified their hopes, just like he falsified the hopes of William Miller. It seems that Walter Scott espoused a premillennial viewpoint. He had almost the same position as William Miller. Walter Scott wrote a series of articles in the Evangelist in the mid-30s, which he claims that his postmillennial viewpoint had been influenced by Whitby's treatise on the millennium, and he felt that this was the cause of much of the speculation that had been going on at that time. And from this time, he espoused a premillennial viewpoint. But when the Lord did not come, when Miller said he would, then Scott, of course, cautioned that people should not rush into print, I suppose. He says that we must allow past experiences to improve our future course. And he says that history has not exhausted the contents of the sixth vial. He thought prior to that the sixth vial had been exhausted, that the book of Revelation had been fulfilled up through and beyond the sixth vial. It was ready for the seventh vial, and he felt that this was the millennium, the last period of history. But after this, Scott seemed to have espoused similar position to that of Campbell. He edited for a while from 1844 to 1848 a paper called The Protestant Unionists. And he sought to bring about this unity upon the basis of the Bible, just like Campbell had. And this, of course, throughout the years of the 50s. These post-millennial people sought to purify the church. And a criticism of them has been that they sought to bring in the millennium by their own efforts. They thought that by themselves and by their own work they could bring in the millennium, somewhat force the millennium to be brought into existence. And people begin to think, well, this is not the way the millennium is going to occur. You know, somebody said recently that the main problem with the second coming is that it hadn't happened. And that is a problem. That's been the problem all these years. So after the Civil War and after division had wrecked the hopes and the tendency of these people to believe that the millennium would occur and that Christ's return would follow, they began to swing to a premillennial viewpoint, thinking that only Christ could inaugurate the millennium. And so there was a swing toward the premillennial viewpoint. Conditions were such that it seemed that the triumphant church could only exist after the coming of Jesus Christ. And so it was that premillennial viewpoints began to emerge. In the writing of men like Moses Lard and later J. Harding are filled with ideas that are premillennial in nature. But these men referred to their position as theoretical. They did not speak the way modern dispensationalists speak. In fact, Lard's article is called A Theory of the Millennium. They were not dispensationalists, and they were not hobbyists. These men were men who were studying the matter. They were living in a time when they felt that full investigation should be made and investigate all sides of questions that were issues in those days. And so these men, even though they are quoted today by dispensationalists, do not represent dispensationalists. They do not represent dispensational viewpoints. But if someone would quote Alexander Campbell as a premillennialist when he says, you know, there isn't going to be anything that can be said or anything that can be brought to bear that would suggest even that Christ would come before the millennium. Still just quoted as a premillennialist. You could believe that. Now, in the Restoration movement, there have been mainly three divisions that have been produced as a result of millennial viewpoints. And I must hurry through these because their time is getting by. John Thomas is known for his rebaptism issue, and he's also a man who divided the church in Virginia. William Darst says that, or Jackson Darst says that the division that took place in Virginia over the Thomasite position of the kingdom and revelation and prophecy, and Thomas published a number of periodicals, one of them called The Herald of the Future Age, The Apostolic Advocate and the Prophetic Interpreter, 3 or 4 periodicals suggestive of his viewpoint. He felt that there was no such thing as the eternal existence of the soul. Darst said that the controversy in Virginia was more bitter than the controversy between the Reformers and the Evangelists for a 10-year period. And there was finally a separation. Thomas denounced the church in America. He went to England and deceived the church there into thinking that he was in fellowship with the church in America and told them that he was. And he led off a number of brethren in England into his position until they found out that Thomas had been disfellowshipped by the church in the United States. The Thomasites became known as the Christadelphians. Because Thomas did not want these people to bear his name, he decided that they should be called Christadelphians. Christadelphianism came up again in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Texas. There was a man in Abilene, a former editor of a secular paper, began to preach and to teach millennial dawnism. In the late part of the century, in 1894, he was charged by writers in the Firm Foundation being a dawnist. He promptly denied this, but he continued to teach doctrines that were related to the ideas of Charles Russell. And so, of course, the influence of this man through his teaching, his preaching, and the publication of a paper called Word and Work. This paper began in Abilene in April of 1895 and continued until the death of this man, William L. Gibbs, in 1907. It was issued a few years after his death by his wife. This was promptly called a Christadelphian paper. Gibbs was a respected preacher in the church in West Texas. And when he was joined by another man by the name of A.S. Bradley, in the early part of the 20th century, these men were quite influential in the church in West Texas. And some of the older brethren in West Texas tell us that these ideas, especially for these men and the influence of this paper, almost captured the church and divided many churches in West Texas. And it was not until the debate between A.S. Bradley and C.R. Nickel in rural Texas in 1906 that it began to wane. Of course, the death of Gibbs and the demise of his paper was probably another factor involved here. But the Nickel-Bradley debate, for all practical purposes, revealed Christadelphianism in the church in West Texas, but not until after it had divided a number of churches. I enjoy reading this period, and I found one good example of a statement of the type of controversy that went on. Brother T.R. Burnett, the spicy editor of Burnett's Budget, which was a column in the Gospel at this time. Burnett had published a paper, Bonham, beginning in 1875. This was the first gospel paper, weekly paper, published in Texas by any of our brethren. Burnett was a very, very gifted writer, as was Austin McGarry, the editor of the Firm Foundation. When these two men jumped on a subject, well, you know something was going to fly. And Burnett says of Gibbs, Brother William Gibbs almost convinced himself that there was no hell until he struck the wrath of the Firm Foundation. And now he thinks that from the fire and the brimstone and bad smell up about Capitol, really, he may possibly have made a mistake about it. But this is part of our history. It shows what can happen. People began to espouse speculative ideas. Bullism, of course, emerges in the second decade of the 20th century. I don't have time to read, and that's what I would do at that time, just read statements taken from the word work, printed by Brother Bowl. And these are all in the book. You can read them. I don't want to present Brother Bowl, but Brother Bowl was nothing but a dispensationalist. He espoused the interpretive viewpoint of dispensationalists. He espoused the chronology of dispensationalists. And I've taken statements from his own writing to show that he accepts the dichotomy between Israel and the church. He accepts the division of gospel into the gospel of the kingdom and the gospel of grace. And I thought Brother Harper would probably talk about the consequences of this in his presentation, but I see that he took another route. But what are the consequences of this? Does it really, this fellowshipping that has occurred, that's not my place to describe. But we ask this question: what would have happened? Would there have been any work of Christ upon the cross if the Jews had accepted Christ as the king and the kingdom had been established? Brother Bowl accepted the idea that the church was in existence, that the kingdom was in existence. He did put the parentheses on the church as Darby had done. And it's noticeable that he says that he espoused, he had the viewpoint that he had in 1919. It was 1990. That's the year the Scofield Bible came.